The most quoted text in Christianity is also the least followed, and not because of hypocrisy, not because of moral weakness, but because following the Sermon on the Mount to the letter means dismantling piece by piece everything you have been taught about how to live well, have value, and be someone in this world. Sunday morning, a crowded church. The pastor reads the Beatitudes in a solemn voice. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The congregation closes their eyes and nods their heads in reverence. But as the words echo through the hall, a woman in the third row is mentally reviewing the presentation she has to give on Monday. She mentally practices how to position herself, how to speak firmly, how to show confidence. She knows she needs to stand out, prove her competence, show that she deserves to be there. The pastor's voice continues, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." And she thinks, if I'm meek, they'll walk all over me. There is no hypocrisy here. There is something deeper. There is a structural chasm between what Jesus proposed and what modern survival demands. And that chasm is not accidental. It is revealing. The Sermon on the Mount is not a set of aspirational Christian virtues. It is a manifesto of complete reversal. Jesus is not saying be better. He's saying everything you think makes you worthy, valuable, secure is the opposite. And that's not comforting. That's destabilizing. Because think about what he's proposing. Poor in spirit, not self-confident, not determined, not self-assured, meek, not assertive, not competitive, not dominant, merciful, not righteous, not vengeful, not balanced in reciprocity. And then, as if that weren't enough, comes the most brutal part. When you give alms, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. When you pray, don't do it in public. When you fast, don't show it. Do good, but don't be seen doing it. This is not only a difficult proposition, it is a proposition incompatible with the psychological structure of how we construct identity. Because the entire modern architecture of meaning depends on recognition. You don't just work, you post about your work. You don't just help someone, you share it. You don't just achieve something, you announce it. Because if no one sees it, did it happen? Are you someone if no one witnesses it? Jesus is proposing the opposite. Be, but don't need them to see. And that's where the tension comes in. Because there's a reason why this text, so central to Christianity, is recited but not lived. There's a reason why entire churches can fill temples on Sundays, listen to the sermon, call it sacred, and on Monday live exactly as the world around them lives. The reason is not a lack of faith. It is that the sermon exposes something that no one wants to see, that the way we have been taught to seek meaning, value, and security is structurally inverted, that we are accumulating things that do not sustain us, that we are seeking validation in places that empty us, that we are building identities on foundations that crumble when no one is looking. And Jesus knew this. He wasn't offering an aspirational moral code. He was diagnosing. He was pointing to the wound, and the wound is still open. The Sermon on the Mount didn't fail because it's idealistic. It failed because it is too true. Because following what it proposes would require undoing almost everything you have learned about how to earn respect, how to be taken seriously, how to survive socially. And that is not an individual failure. It is structural. It is the cost of living in a world where identity depends on performance, where value depends on achievement, where security depends on accumulation. But something happens when you really read the sermon, not as a religious text, but as a psychological diagnosis. When you realize that it is not asking for virtue, it is showing you where the trap is. And once you see the trap, something changes. Not because you can get out of it, but because now you know you are in it. The first sentence of the Sermon on the Mount is already a problem. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. For centuries, this phrase has been domesticated, transformed into praise for humility, into moral virtue, into advice to not be arrogant. But that's not what it says. Poor in spirit does not mean humble. It means emptied. It means without internal substance. It means someone who does not have an inflated self-image to defend. And that in the modern world is a social death sentence. Because everything you've been taught about having value depends on the opposite. Building a strong identity, knowing who you are, having self-confidence, believing in yourself, having conviction, not wavering, not doubting. The entire culture is structured around the idea that you need to be someone, and that someone needs to be consistent, solid, impressive. Think about how you present yourself professionally, not just what you do, but how you describe yourself. I'm a strategist. I'm creative. I'm a leader. Each word is a piece of identity being cemented. And the more you repeat these pieces, the more you depend on them. Because if you're a strategist, then failing at a strategy isn't just a mistake, it's a threat to your identity. If you're a leader, then being questioned isn't just uncomfortable, it's a crack in the image you've built of yourself. Jesus looks at this construction and says, blessed are those who don't have it. It's not praise, it's a diagnosis. He's pointing to the psychological cost of living by defending a self-image. Because self-image needs constant maintenance. It needs validation. It needs victories. And when it doesn't get them, it crumbles. And then comes anxiety, frustration, the feeling of failing at something fundamental. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard had a term for this: the despair of wanting to be yourself. The idea that you can build a fixed, solid, definitive identity, and that this identity will sustain you. But it doesn't, because identity built on achievements is fragile. Any failure shakes it. Any criticism threatens it. You spend your whole life not living, but defending the version of yourself that you have decided you need to be. And this is not abstract. It operates every day. On social media, for example, the need to maintain a consistent persona, to post things that reinforce the image you cultivate. I am someone who travels. I am someone who reads. I am someone who is productive. And then comes exhaustion, because you can't falter. You can't contradict the image. You can't appear lost, confused, directionless. Because if you do, the whole structure shakes. Every post is a performance. Every photo is curated. And deep down you know it. You know you're choosing angles, editing captions, controlling the narrative. But you can't stop, because stopping seems like admitting that there's nothing behind the performance. And that possibility is terrifying. Jesus proposes the opposite. Empty it out. Don't build. Don't defend. Don't try to be someone impressive. Because freedom isn't in having a strong identity. It's in not needing one. But that sounds impossible. Because how do you survive without a consolidated identity? How do you compete? How do you stand out? How are you taken seriously? And there's the point. You're not. And Jesus is saying that's not a problem. It's a prerequisite. Blessed. Not cursed, not failures. Blessed. There is something deeply disturbing about this, because it means that the entire culture has taught you to seek the opposite of what brings peace. It has taught you that self-confidence brings security, that a strong identity brings stability, that believing in yourself solves anxiety. And the sermon says no, all of that only adds to the burden, because now you have something to lose. Now you need to defend yourself. Now you are hostage to the opinions of others, to the next achievement, to constant validation. And perhaps that is why the next phrase is even more disconcerting. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Meek, not assertive, not dominant, not competitive. In a world where assertiveness is taught as an essential skill, where knowing how to assert yourself is a sign of maturity, where defending your space is a matter of survival, Jesus praises the meek. And again, he is not asking for virtue. He is pointing to a structure, the structure of perpetual competition, the structure where you only have value if you conquer space, if you are faster, if you are smarter, if you are more visible. And this structure never rests, because there is always someone else. There is always another space to conquer. There is always another battle. And Jesus looks at this and says, the meek shall inherit the earth, not because they will fight for it, but because they are not fighting. This is not naive passivity. It is the dissolution of a game that never had a real winner, because the game of competition for space has no finish line. It only has the next contest. And those who play spend their entire lives running without knowing where to. Just running because stopping seems like surrender. There are endless meetings where you have to prove you deserve to be in the room. There are conversations where you measure every word so as not to appear weak. There are moments when you smile when you would rather remain silent, because silence can be read as defeat. And all of this consumes you. Not just time, psychological energy. The energy of constantly being on the defensive, of never letting your guard down, of always performing competence, control, confidence. And at the end of the day, when you're alone, exhausted, the question that arises is simple. What for? But you don't answer, because answering seems dangerous. It seems like giving up something you've spent years building. So you push the question down, and the next day, you're back in the game, because that's what you do. That's what everyone does. But maybe stopping isn't surrender. Maybe it's the only move that gets you out of the race. And maybe the race was never the way. Maybe it was always the trap. A trap where the more you run, the further you get from anywhere that matters. And if that already seems radical, we haven't even gotten to the part that really corrodes everything you've built. Because now Jesus goes beyond who you are. He's going to attack what you do and who sees you doing it. The next layer of the sermon isn't about who you are. It's about what you do. And more importantly, who sees you doing it. When you give alms, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. When you pray, close the door and pray in secret. When you fast, don't make your sacrifice public. Do good, but don't be seen. This is not only counterintuitive, it is structurally incompatible with the logic of how modern society works. Because today, value is recognized or it doesn't exist. An achievement that is not shared is an achievement wasted. You don't just do, you document. You don't just live, you prove that you lived. Because if no one saw it, did it happen? Does it matter? There is an entire economy built on this, the attention economy. And in this economy, visibility is currency. The more you are seen doing something good, the more you are worth. The more you share your efforts, the more social capital you accumulate. Every post about a completed project, every photo of a meaningful moment, every update on progress. It's not gratuitous vanity, it's a survival strategy. Because if you don't become visible, you disappear. And Jesus proposes exactly the opposite, disappear. Not out of performative humility, not because showing off is wrong, but because every time you do something to be seen, you contaminate the act. You divide the intention. Half of the action is in the action. The other half is in the reaction you expect. And then you're no longer doing, you're performing. And performance needs an audience. And the audience needs to applaud. And if they don't applaud, the act loses its meaning. Think of something simple. You help someone, genuinely, and no one sees it. No one comments. No one recognizes it. How do you feel? If the immediate answer is it was enough, then maybe you understand what Jesus was saying. But if the answer is a subtle discomfort, a feeling that something is incomplete, then you are operating within the structure he is dismantling. The structure where good is only validated if it is recognized. And there is no moral judgment here, because this structure is not your fault. You were trained for it. Since childhood, you have been taught that your achievements matter when they are seen, that your effort is legitimate when it is noticed, that your value increases when others confirm it, and it becomes automatic. It becomes the way you relate to everything you do. The difference is simple but devastating. Planting a tree that will be seen versus planting a tree that will never be photographed. The two actions are physically identical, but psychologically, completely different. Because when you plant to be seen, you are feeding something outside yourself. When you plant without expecting recognition, you are feeding something inside. And the second option is terrifying, because it means you need to find meaning without external validation. And most people have never been taught to do that. Jesus knew this, and that's why he's not asking for public kindness. He's asking for invisible integrity, which is the opposite of performative virtue. Performative virtue needs witnesses. Invisible integrity needs no one but you. And that, in the modern world, is almost impossible to sustain, because you've been conditioned to measure your worth by the perception of others. And if perception doesn't exist, value disappears. There is an interesting psychological experiment. Children do tasks alone. Some are praised publicly. Others receive no external recognition. Then, when there are no more observers, the children who were conditioned to public praise lose motivation. Those who never depended on external recognition continue, because the reward was in the action, not in the reaction. And this doesn't stop in childhood. It continues throughout life. You work on an important project, alone, without anyone knowing. And then the inevitable question arises, is it worth it? If no one will see it, if no one will recognize it, if it won't generate any visible return, does it still make sense? And if the answer is no, then you already know where you are placing your sense of value, in the eyes of others, in external approval, in social validation. And then comes the most brutal phrase in the sermon, you cannot serve God and mammon, wealth, but not just money. It's accumulation. It's the principle of gathering things to feel secure. And Jesus doesn't say it's difficult to serve both. He says, you cannot. It is structurally impossible, because serving means devoting attention, and attention cannot be divided without fragmenting. If you place your security in accumulation, whether money, status, achievements, recognition, then your attention is constantly on what is lacking, on what can be lost, on what needs to be protected. And then you are not living, you are managing. Managing a pile of things that deep down do not sustain you, but you cannot let go of them, because letting go seems to open up an abyss. And maybe the abyss is already open. Maybe you just built a structure around it and called it security. And maybe Jesus is pointing to the structure and saying, this does not protect you, it imprisons you. Because accumulating generates anxiety. It doesn't relieve it. The more you have, the more you have to lose. The more you build, the more you need to defend. And then your whole life becomes an effort of maintenance. Maintenance of image, maintenance of assets, maintenance of status. And you never rest, because there is always more to protect. There is always more to conquer. There is always the possibility of loss. You look at your bank balance, at your resume, at your followers, at your listed achievements, and you feel something strange, because it should be satisfaction, but it's not. It's worry. Worry that it's not enough, that it could be taken away, that tomorrow it could be worth less. And then you realize you're not accumulating security, you're accumulating vulnerabilities. And Jesus looks at this and says, let go. Not because possessions are bad, but because the more you invest your identity in them, the more you become a hostage to them. And then the question is not what do you have? The question is, what do you have? But let go of what? Let go how? And therein lies the real terror of the sermon. Because it doesn't give you a manual. He doesn't give step-by-step instructions. He just points to the reversal. And the reversal is clear. You were taught that accumulating brings peace, and it doesn't. You were taught that being seen brings value, and it doesn't. You were taught that building a strong identity brings security, and it doesn't. So what does? That question remains unanswered, because the answer doesn't come easily, and maybe it never will. But one thing changes when you see the reversal. You stop deceiving yourself. You stop believing that the next achievement will solve everything, that the next recognition will fulfill you, that the next acquisition will calm you down. And then, for the first time, you see the game for what it is. A game with no winners. Just increasingly exhausted players, accumulating things that don't deliver what they promised, and seeing it doesn't solve anything, but it stops you from continuing to play without knowing. And perhaps that is the only real freedom available. But then Jesus goes deeper, because up to this point, the sermon has dismantled the construction of identity and the need for external validation. Now he is going to attack something even more fundamental, the logic of reciprocity, the idea that relationships work as balanced exchanges, the notion that kindness must be reciprocated, that effort deserves recognition, that those who hurt you should be treated in kind. You have heard that it was said, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And suddenly the ground disappears, because everything you've learned about justice, about dignity, about self-respect is anchored in reciprocity. If someone helps you, you repay them. If someone attacks you, you defend yourself. If someone disrespects you, you set boundaries. Not out of petty revenge, but out of self-preservation. Because allowing someone to hurt you without response seems like weakness. It seems to set a precedent. It seems to invite further abuse. And Jesus says, love those who hate you. This is not romantic poetry. This is the demolition of an entire system of how you organize your relationships. Because human relationships work in practice like emotional accounting. You keep a mental scorecard. Who did what? Who owes what? Who deserves more attention? Who deserves less? And this scorecard is not conscious most of the time, but it operates constantly. Think about how you react when someone does not reciprocate a gesture. You helped. You made an effort. You were there, and the person simply did not respond. How does that affect you? If the answer is it doesn't affect me, then you may be among the rare few who understood what Jesus proposed. But if the answer is a subtle irritation, a sense of injustice, a thought of after all I've done, then you're operating within the logic of reciprocity. The logic where kindness is an investment, and investment needs to return. And there is no judgment here. Because this logic is deeply human. It makes evolutionary sense. It makes social sense. You cooperate with those who cooperate with you. You distance yourself from those who harm you. This keeps communities functioning. It protects you from being exploited. It is rational. It is fair. It is what any sensible person would do. And Jesus proposes the opposite. Not because reciprocity is wrong, but because it traps you in a cycle of perpetual reaction. Because if you only love those who love you, then your love depends on the behavior of others. If you are only kind to those who are kind to you, then your kindness is not a choice. It is a conditioned response. And then you are not living. You are reacting, constantly measuring, constantly adjusting, constantly in defensive mode. There is a specific exhaustion in this. The exhaustion of keeping score, of remembering who ignored you in a situation, who didn't recognize your effort, who failed to reciprocate, and then you adjust. You pull away, you give less, you build walls, and you call it maturing, learning to protect yourself, not being a sucker. And maybe all of that is valid, but it comes at a cost. The cost is that you never act freely. You always act in response, in reaction, measuring, calculating, and in the process you lose something. You lose the ability to act from an inner center that doesn't depend on what the other person did or didn't do. Jesus is not asking you to be a doormat. He's not asking you to accept abuse. He is pointing to something deeper, to the fact that as long as your action depends on the action of others, you have no real autonomy. You only have reflexes, and reflexes are not freedom. There is a phrase in Buddhism that says something similar. Holding on to anger is like holding on to hot coals with the intention of throwing them at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. And what Jesus is saying is similar. When you hate those who hate you, when you retaliate against those who hurt you, when you keep the score even, you are not protecting yourself. You are imprisoning yourself, because now that person has power over you. Power to define your internal state, power to occupy your attention, power to make you spend psychological energy reacting. And the more you react, the more you feed the cycle, because anger needs fuel, and the fuel is the narrative you repeat. After what they did to me, they don't deserve it. I have every right, and maybe you do. But having the right doesn't mean exercising it will set you free. Because in the end, the question isn't, do you have the right to fight back? The question is, does fighting back get you where you want to go? And often the answer is no. Fighting back keeps you stuck in the same dynamic. It keeps you at war. It keeps you spending attention on those who hurt you. And then you realize, you're not defending yourself. You're holding yourself hostage. Jesus is proposing the dissolution of the reactive ego, the ego that needs to be right. That needs to win. That needs justice to be done according to its personal metrics. And dissolving that is not weakness. It is perhaps the most difficult thing there is, because it means giving up something that seems essential. The right to be right. The right to be avenged. The right for the other to acknowledge their mistake. And when you give that up, something strange happens. You don't feel defeated. You feel free, because now that person no longer has power over you. They can continue to hate you. They can continue to attack you. And you're just not playing anymore. Not because you gave up, but because you realized it was a game with no winners. But that sounds impossible, because how do you love those who hurt you? How do you pray for those who persecute you? How do you turn the other cheek? And there's the point. Maybe you can't. Maybe that's beyond the average human capacity. But the sermon isn't a manual of conduct. It's a mirror. It shows you where you are. It shows you what holds you back. It shows you how much energy you spend keeping the score even. And when you see that, when you really see it, something changes. Not because you become a saint, but because now you know you have a choice. You can continue to react, or you can stop. And stopping is not surrender, it is freedom. But if this reversal already seems radical, it has not yet touched on the most painful point. Because now Jesus is going to talk about what you accumulate, and why none of it sustains you. And then we get to the heart of the sermon, the point where Jesus is no longer dismantling behaviors. He is exposing the psychological structure that underpins everything. And the phrase is simple, direct, impossible to ignore. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It's not a poetic metaphor, it's an accurate diagnosis. Because where you put your attention, energy, concern, that's where your identity is. And the central question is not what you accumulate, it's why you accumulate. Because if you accumulate to feel secure, then your security depends on things that can be lost. And then you are never secure. You are just managing the fear of losing. Jesus says, do not store up treasures on earth, where moths and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. And the immediate reaction is, of course, that makes sense. Material things are temporary. But it's not about materialism versus spirituality. It's about where you place your sense of value. Because you may not accumulate money and still be accumulating other things. Professional achievements, social recognition, validating relationships, a public image that sustains you. And all of these things have the same fragility as material possessions. They can be lost. They can fall apart. They can reveal that they were never what you thought they were. And when they collapse, what is left? That's the question no one wants to answer. Because the honest answer most of the time is nothing, or almost nothing. Because you built your identity on achievements. And when the achievements disappear, your identity shakes. And then comes despair. Not because you lost something external, but because you realize you never had anything internal that could sustain the loss. Nietzsche observed something similar. He said that modern man is sick because he no longer knows what to value. Because the old values have collapsed, but the new ones have no substance. And so people spend their lives accumulating things that don't deliver what they promised. They accumulate money but not security. They accumulate achievements but not satisfaction. They accumulate recognition but not meaning. And Jesus is pointing exactly to that. He is not saying don't have possessions. He is saying be careful what you make your foundation. Because if the foundation is fragile, everything you build on it will collapse. And then comes the phrase that has never been taken seriously. You cannot serve both God and mammon. Mammon, wealth. But in the context of the sermon, it's not just money. It's the principle of accumulation as a source of identity. And Jesus doesn't say it's difficult to serve both. He says it's impossible. Because to serve means to devote attention. And fragmented attention serves no one. If you wake up thinking about what you need to achieve, if you spend the day managing what you've already achieved, if you go to sleep worried about what you might lose, then where is your attention? It is not in the present. It is not in genuine relationships. It is not in anything that really sustains you. It is in an endless race, a race where the finish line always moves further away. Because the more you accumulate, the more you have to lose. And then achievement does not bring peace. It brings anxiety. There is an image that illustrates this perfectly. A person who spent 20 years building a career. They sacrificed time. They sacrificed relationships. They sacrificed health. And they got where they wanted to be. They have the job. They have the salary. They have the recognition. And then, in a moment of silence, perhaps late at night, perhaps on an empty Sunday, the question arises, now what? Because there should be satisfaction. There should be fulfillment. But there isn't. There is only the realization that nothing that has been achieved fills the void that has always been there. And then comes the temptation to accumulate more, to seek the next goal, to believe that maybe the next achievement will finally solve it. But it doesn't solve it. It never has, and it never will. Because the problem is not the lack of achievements. It is having placed your identity in them. Jesus is exposing this trap. He is saying, you have spent your life accumulating treasures that do not sustain you, and now you are trapped. Because letting go seems to open up an abyss, but holding on does not bring peace. It only brings the obligation to keep holding on. And then he asks the question that no one wants to hear. Where is your treasure? Not where you say it is, where it really is. You may say you value family, friends, health, purpose, but where do you spend your attention? Where do you spend your energy? Where do you spend your concern? Because that's where your real treasure is. And if you're honest, you may find that you've been spending it all on things that don't matter as much as you'd like to believe. And there's no judgment here, because we all do it. We've all been trained to do it. The entire culture is structured around the idea that accumulating brings security. And it takes time to realize that it doesn't. That the more you accumulate, the more vulnerable you become. Because now you have points of failure. You have things that can be taken away. You have achievements that can crumble. And each of them carries a piece of your identity. And Jesus looks at this and says something radical. Let go. Not because possessions are bad. Not because achievements are empty. But because as long as you place your identity in them, you are not free. You are a hostage. A hostage to the fear of losing. A hostage to the need to keep. Hostage to the next threat, the next crisis, the next possibility of collapse. And letting go doesn't mean dropping everything and becoming an ascetic. It means changing where you place your identity. It means recognizing that nothing external can sustain you internally, and that trying to make it sustain you is what generates chronic anxiety, persistent emptiness, the feeling that something is always missing. But letting go of this is terrifying, because it means admitting that you have built on sand, that you have invested years, perhaps decades, in things that do not bring you what you expected. And admitting this feels like loss. It feels like failure. It feels like everything was in vain. But maybe it wasn't in vain. Maybe it was necessary. Because only after building on sand and seeing it collapse do you learn where not to build. And then, for the first time, you have a chance to find something that really sustains you. If this is touching something, if you recognize this pattern, if you feel that you have built your life on shaky foundations, subscribe to the channel. Because this kind of conversation, this kind of honest confrontation with the invisible structure that organizes our lives is exactly what we will continue to explore here. And the question that remains now is, if you let go, what is left? If you stop accumulating identity and achievements, where do you find sustenance? Because Jesus hasn't answered that yet. He just dismantled it. And what comes after dismantling is perhaps the most disconcerting part of all. And then, after dismantling identity, external validation, reciprocity, and accumulation, Jesus points to the inevitable consequence of all this: anxiety. Do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or drink, nor about your body, what you will wear. Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. And again, this sounds naive, romantic, disconnected from reality, because you have bills to pay, you have responsibilities, you have people who depend on you. So how can you not worry? How can you not plan? How can you not anticipate everything that could go wrong? But Jesus is not asking for irresponsibility. He is diagnosing where anxiety comes from. Because modern anxiety is not just practical concern for survival, it is something deeper. It is the constant feeling that you need to control the uncontrollable, that you need to guarantee the future, that if you don't anticipate every possibility, everything will fall apart. And this need for control doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes directly from having placed your identity in fragile things. Because if your security depends on achievements, then you need to protect each achievement. If your identity depends on recognition, then you need to ensure that recognition continues. If your value depends on accumulation, then you need to accumulate more, always more, because it's never enough. And then you never rest, because there is always something to protect. There is always something to achieve. There is always the possibility of loss. And that possibility keeps you in a state of permanent alertness. And permanent alertness is not healthy vigilance. It is chronic anxiety. Alan Watts, a philosopher who studied Buddhism and Christianity, said something interesting. Insecurity is the price of excessive self-awareness. What he meant is that the more you observe yourself, the more you monitor your social position, your achievements, your image, the more insecure you become. Because now you see all the ways you can fail, all the ways you can be judged, all the ways you can lose what you have built. And Jesus is pointing to this when he talks about birds. It's not that birds don't work. They work, but they don't anticipate catastrophes. They don't hoard to secure a distant future. They don't live in fear of what might go wrong. They exist, and somehow that's enough. And you may think, but I'm not a bird. I'm conscious. I know bad things can happen. And that's true, but knowing doesn't force you to live in fear. It doesn't force you to turn every day into preparation for catastrophe. It doesn't force you to sacrifice the present to try to secure a future that may never come. Because maybe anxiety doesn't come from not being prepared. Maybe it comes from trying to control what cannot be controlled, from trying to guarantee what cannot be guaranteed, from trying to accumulate enough security to never feel fear again. And that is impossible, because absolute security does not exist, and trying to achieve it only generates more anxiety. There are people who work compulsively, not because they need to, but because stopping seems dangerous. Because if they are not producing, if they are not achieving, if they are not accumulating, then what are they doing? And then rest becomes guilt, leisure becomes waste, and life becomes an endless race, where stopping seems like surrender. And Jesus looks at this and says, stop, not because work is bad, but because working compulsively to accumulate security does not bring security. It brings exhaustion, because you never arrive, you never have enough, you are never secure enough to relax. And so you spend your whole life, postponing peace, postponing presence, always in function of a future that, when it arrives, reveals that it was not what you expected. And anxiety is not just about money or possessions. It's about everything, about relationships that can end, about health that can fail, about reputation that can be tarnished, about control that can be lost. And the more you try to control, the more anxious you become, because perfect control is an illusion. And illusions, when confronted with reality, crumble. But there is something liberating about recognizing this, about admitting that you don't control as much as you would like, that the future cannot be guaranteed, that bad things can happen no matter how much you prepare, and that maybe, just maybe, living with this uncertainty is healthier than living trying to eliminate it. Because eliminating uncertainty is eliminating life. It is turning everything into calculation, into prediction, into anticipation. And then you are no longer living. You are just trying not to die. And there is a huge difference between the two. Jesus ends this part of the sermon with a phrase that sums it all up. Each day has its own troubles. It's not optimism. It's not a promise that everything will work out. It's a recognition that problems exist, and they will continue to exist. But living in anticipation of all future problems solves nothing. It only adds the weight of the future to the present. And then you carry two burdens, what is happening now and what may happen later. And perhaps freedom is not in eliminating problems. It lies in stopping carrying problems that don't yet exist, in dealing with what is here now, without adding the weight of everything that may come. Because what may come may never come. And then you've wasted energy, attention, life on ghosts. And that leads to an inevitable question. If all this is true, if Jesus really diagnosed where the trap lies, why doesn't anyone live like this? Why has the sermon been so domesticated, spiritualized, made symbolic? Why can entire churches recite it without following it? And then we come to the question that no one wants to ask out loud. If the Sermon on the Mount is so central to Christianity, if it is so often quoted, so revered, so considered sacred, why does no one really live by what is written there? It is not individual hypocrisy. It is not moral weakness. It is something structural, something that Kierkegaard noticed in the 19th century and that remains true today. Christianity has been abolished by Christendom. What he meant is simple and devastating. Institutional religion has transformed the radicalism of Jesus into manageable doctrine. It has transformed rupture into routine. It has transformed confrontation into comfort. Because following the sermon literally is incompatible with social survival. It is incompatible with the market economy. It is incompatible with power structures. It is incompatible with the way civilizations are built and maintained. And so the solution was simple. Spiritualize it. Make it symbolic. Turn it into an unattainable ideal that no one really expects to fulfill, but that everyone can admire from afar. And then you have churches packed on Sundays, people listening to "Blessed are the poor in spirit," while mentally planning how to stand out on Monday. You have sermons on loving your enemies, followed by conversations in the parking lot about who deserves to be cancelled. You have celebrations of "Do not store up treasures on earth" in temples that cost millions to build. And again, it's not cynicism to point this out. It's recognition that there is a structural contradiction, a contradiction that cannot be resolved without dismantling almost everything. Because the modern world, and perhaps the world always, works on logic opposite to what Jesus proposed. The world works by competition. Jesus proposed meekness. The world works by accumulation. Jesus proposed dispossession. The world functions by reciprocity. Jesus proposed unconditional love. The world functions by visibility. Jesus proposed invisibility. And trying to reconcile these things doesn't work, because they are not differences of degree. They are complete inversions. And so the only way to keep the sermon as a sacred text without it threatening the structure is to make it aspirational. Something beautiful, something inspiring, but not something to be truly followed. Nietzsche saw this from another angle. He said that Jesus proposed the end of resentment. He proposed love that does not hold grudges, that does not keep score, that does not seek revenge. But historical Christianity did the opposite. It turned resentment into a driving force. It turned guilt into a tool of control. It turned fear of hell into motivation. And so what Jesus taught and what institutional religion practiced became completely different things. And it's not that institutions are evil. It's that institutionalizing radicalism always means domesticating it. Because institutions need structure. They need hierarchy. They need rules that work for the majority. And the majority cannot live the sermon literally. So the solution is to turn it into a symbol, into a metaphor, into something you admire but don't practice. And then you can go to church every Sunday, listen to the sermon, call it the Word of God, and on Monday live exactly as any secular person lives, competing, accumulating, reacting, seeking validation. And there is no perceived contradiction, because the sermon has become a distant ideal, not concrete instruction. But there is a cost to this. The cost is that the sermon loses its power. It loses its ability to confront. It loses its function as a diagnostic mirror. And it becomes just another beautiful text among many, another source of inspirational quotes, another set of phrases that fit well in social media posts but that no one really takes seriously. And perhaps this is inevitable, because living the sermon literally would require leaving the social game. It would require giving up almost everything you have been taught about how to be someone, how to have value, how to survive. And most people cannot do that. They have families to support. They have bills to pay. They have responsibilities that do not allow for radicalism. So the sermon becomes ideal for monks, for saints, for extraordinary people who can live outside normal structures. And the rest of us admire, quote, revere, but don't follow, because following seems incompatible with living. And then comes the most difficult question. Did Jesus know that? Did he know he was proposing something impossible for most people? Was the sermon meant to be followed, or to be a mirror that shows you where you are? Because perhaps the function of the sermon was never to create a society of saints. Perhaps it was to expose the invisible structures that organize life, to expose where you place your identity, where you seek security, where you spend your energy. And once exposed, you have a choice. Not the choice to follow the sermon perfectly, because that may be impossible, but the choice to see the game for what it is. And seeing the game changes something, because now you know you're playing. You know that the race for achievements has no finish line. You know that accumulating does not bring peace. You know that external validation never completely fulfills you. You know that reciprocity keeps you stuck in reactive cycles. And knowing this doesn't take you out of the game, but it stops you from playing unconsciously. It stops you from believing that the next achievement will solve everything. It stops you from placing your entire identity in fragile things. It stops you from living as if inversion doesn't exist. And perhaps that is the only honest way to relate to the sermon. Not pretending that you live it. Not spiritualizing it until it loses meaning, but also not ignoring it, letting it function as a mirror, as a diagnosis, as a constant reminder that there is an inversion at work, and that this inversion explains a lot about why nothing seems enough. Because in the end, the sermon did not fail. We are not living in the world it describes, and perhaps we never have. and perhaps we never will. But knowing this, seeing it clearly, is already a form of freedom. Not the freedom to leave the game completely, but the freedom to play knowing that it is a game, and that there is something beyond it, even if you never get there completely. And then the question that remains is, what do you do with that? Now that you've seen it, now that you know, now that the sermon has exposed the inversion and you can no longer pretend you don't see it. What changes? What changes is subtle. It's not a dramatic conversion. It's not abandoning everything to become an ascetic. It's not following the sermon to the letter and becoming a saint. What changes is awareness. And awareness is irreversible, because once you see where the inversion is, you can no longer not see it. You continue living. You continue working. You continue competing when necessary. You continue accumulating what you need to accumulate. But now you know. You know you're playing a game. You know the game has no real winners. You know the finish line always moves further away. And knowing this changes your relationship with everything. You achieve something, and you feel satisfaction. But you also see that the satisfaction is temporary, that soon the next goal will come, the next test, the next need for validation. And instead of despairing over it, you simply acknowledge, here we go again. And there is a lightness in acknowledging it, because you are no longer being deceived. You are no longer hoping that this time will be different. You are hurt by someone, and anger arises, the urge to fight back, to even the score. And then for a second, you remember, this keeps me trapped. And maybe you still react. Maybe you still fight back. But there is a space between the stimulus and the response, a space that did not exist before. And in that space lies the possibility of choice. You accumulate. You protect what you have accumulated. And then you realize, I'm spending energy protecting things that don't sustain me. And maybe you continue to protect because it's practical, because it's necessary. But you no longer place your identity in it. You no longer believe that it defines who you are. And then the loss, when it comes, doesn't bring everything crashing down, because you were never completely there. This is not enlightenment. It is not transcendence. It is something simpler and more difficult. It is living aware of the inversion. It is knowing that you have been trained to seek value, security, and meaning in places that do not contain them, and that continuing to seek there will not change the outcome. But that maybe you need to keep seeking anyway, because that's what humans do, and there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you know it. The Sermon on the Mount is not an instruction manual. It never was. It is a mirror, and mirrors don't tell you what to do. They just show you what's there. And what's there for most of us is a life built on inversions. A life where we chase after things that promise to fulfill us but never completely do. Where we defend fragile identities. Where we react automatically. Where we accumulate to feel secure but only manage to accumulate vulnerabilities. And Jesus looked at this and said, there is another way. But he never guaranteed that the other way would be possible for everyone. He never promised it would be easy. He never turned it into an organized religion with practical steps. He just pointed it out. And he let each person decide what to do with what they saw. And perhaps the only honesty possible is this: to recognize that you have seen, that you can no longer pretend you haven't seen, but that you also cannot live completely outside of what you have seen, and that this is not failure. It is the human condition. It is the tension between seeing the inversion and still living within it, between recognizing the game and still needing to play, between knowing that nothing external sustains you and still needing external things to live. There is a scene in the Gospel after the sermon where a rich young man approaches Jesus and asks what he must do to have eternal life. And Jesus replies, "Sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and come, follow me." And the young man leaves sadly, because he had many possessions. And Jesus does not run after him. He does not soften his words. He doesn't say, "All right, then follow what you can." He just lets the young man go, because maybe he knew not everyone can do it. Not everyone is ready. Not everyone can let go of everything, and there is no condemnation in that. Just recognition that there is a cost, and that not everyone can pay it. And maybe you are like the rich young man. Maybe you have seen the reversal. You have understood the sermon. You have recognized that you are trapped in structures that do not sustain you, but you cannot let go completely, because there are responsibilities. There are people who depend on you. There is a life built that cannot be dismantled overnight. And that does not mean that seeing it was useless, because now you live differently. Not radically different, but subtly different. You play the game, but you know it's a game. You accumulate, but you don't deposit your identity in it. You compete, but you recognize the cost. You react, but sometimes you manage to pause before reacting. And maybe that's it. Maybe that's the freedom that's possible. Not to completely leave the inversion, but to stop being completely deceived by it. to live knowing, and to let that knowing slowly change small things, small choices, small moments where you choose differently, not because you become a saint, but because you remembered. You remembered that there is another way, even if you can't follow that path completely, even if you go back and back and back to the same patterns. Remembering is already something. Seeing already transforms something. And maybe in the end, that's all that was available from the beginning. You will never live the Sermon on the Mount perfectly, but after truly seeing it, you will never again be completely mistaken about why you live the way you do. And that in itself is already a form of liberation. Small, subtle, but real. Which part of the sermon most confronts the way you live? Write in the comments. Watch the next videos on the channel, count on me, and follow the White Rabbit.